Hello and welcome to the Spiral Lab live stream. It's the Jesse and Marta show again. Here we are. We've been sitting here trying to remind ourselves to look at the camera and not at our screen. So
Eye contact.
making eye contact with you as we're supposed to do. The other thing that's going to make me crazy is that this is going to keep doing that. So yeah, we have a lot of exciting stuff happening at the Spiral Lab, and we're really excited that you're here. We would love to see you in the comments and chat box because that makes us feel like there are actually people. Usually there's there we go.
Hi.
Whitney Reagan is here. Hi, Whitney. You're our first confirmation that we're not just talking into the void. So we really appreciate that. That's super great. So yeah, we have some exciting new things happening soon, including we're both working on vlogs. I have a vlog series that I'm working on that is going to launch next week on Tuesday. I'm committing and trying really hard. Hi, Amanda. Great to see you. Emma is here. Fantastic. Hi, Emma. So look for an announcement. I think that I'm going to try to use the community tab a little bit more on YouTube. I don't really use that very effectively to let you know what's coming up. But I'm going to be trying to vlog once a week, at least for the summer. And those vlogs will come out on Tuesday. And I think you have a vlog that you've been working on.
Yeah, it's kind of like half vlog, half like philosophical thing about gardening. Everything is about gardening for me right now. So.
How is your garden doing? How's it going?
Pretty, like, surprisingly really good.
Yeah.
The squash is very enthusiastically spreading out. His leaves are like this big right now, which is like,
that's
exciting. I just can't believe I did that, you know?
Like from a seed you did that?
Yeah.
That's really fun, isn't it?
And I have some beans, like a kind of bush of beans. And I got a little like greenhouse shelf thing so I can start more seeds.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and they're liking it in there, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool. Well, yeah. So we're both sort of in the midst of working on our gardens and have some vlogs coming out about that. So, yeah. And the other thing that I wanted to announce is that we're on Patreon now. I actually had a Patreon that was woefully neglected, and I feel terrible about it, but it is what it is. And there were a bunch of people who just like stuck with me and kept supporting me, even though I literally never posted anything. But I've decided to switch that Patreon to be the Spiral Lab Patreon to help support this channel and the work that we're doing here. And there are going to be actual perks. I'm not going to neglect you anymore. And one of the perks is going to be that I will publish the vlogs and any kind of pre-recorded video that we make. We'll publish that a day ahead of time on the Patreon, so you get a sneak peek. And I'm also thinking about or intend to include the names of our patrons in a sort of like on the credits at the end of our videos. But if there are other perks that you guys would like, and I would also think, I announced all of this without really checking with Jesse, but I'm sure that Jesse's on board, that we would love to do like a live Ask Us Anything once a month for our patrons. So that would just be like a fun sort of, you can ask us anything and we'll dish. Live once a month. So I think there's a link in the description below if you'd like to become our patrons. We both really kind of feel like this and other work that we're doing, but this is really becoming sort of central to what we want to do, and how we'd like to make a living. So if you'd like to support us in this work, that would be fantastic. Like I said, this is going to keep going. Is there a way to turn off the screensaver? There probably is, but I don't know how to do it.
Just keep tapping it.
Yeah, I'm just going to keep tapping it. But today, what you came for, and then again, as always, we will talk for a while, but we will be periodically checking the chat box, and please feel free in real time to ask any questions or make any comments or share any observations about what we're talking about. And then we'll periodically respond to those. So yeah, Today, what we're going to be talking about is this little paper called The Dysfunctionality of Executive Function. We're not sure how to say the author's name, but I think it's Miriam Cherkes-Julkowski. So Dr. Miriam Cherkes-Julkowski. This is something that I found a couple of years ago when I was starting to have some suspicions about this, all the like hoopla about executive function, because of course it's everywhere, and everybody who talks about sort of disorder and pathology loves to point to executive dysfunction as like the root of all of our problems. And I was starting to be suspicious of that kind of paradigm in general. And so I started Googling around to see if there were critiques of executive function. And this was one of the very first things that I found. And I read it quite a number of years ago now. And it was so interesting to reread it to prepare for this, because I was like, oh, wow, this was really central to my thinking. Like, I don't think that I realized how central her critique of executive function is to like my own critique. So really, I need to give all of the props to her for a lot of the critique that I have of executive function. And even, we'll talk about this, even like she doesn't use the term design thinking, but she's very much talking about design and design thinking. Hi there, Marta. Nice to see you. Marta Bratek is here from London. It always makes my day when I see Marta pop up. Anyway, so we're going to talk about this a little bit. I have to admit that we're feeling a tiny bit executive dysfunctional about how to present this like really rich and complex critique in a way that's going to be manageable and make sense to you. So we're going to do our best. And like maybe we're sort of doing a little bit of...
We'll just circle around and
loop around and... Yeah, we'll do our best. Jesse took a bunch of notes, and then I added some notes, and then we sort of tried to put it into a little bit of a, not exactly a script, but like a little bit of an order of who's going to lead. And so anyway, I'm going to let Jesse start, just sort of explaining kind of the main argument of this little paper and sort of the concept and definition of executive function according to Miriam Cherkes-Julkowski.
So basically, the idea of executive function is a very like central kind of like a control center that controls all these other things that your brain does. And it's really about like rule following and not really paying attention to like context or meaning, but just following rules for the sake of following the rules. And so Dr. Miriam, I'll call her.
Let's just call her Dr. Miriam, yeah.
She thinks that this idea is actually not helpful for problem solving, and that it's outdated, and that it's not fully accurate in terms of like how the brain and just like humans work. She says that it's more reflective of the capacity to conform than the capacity for higher order thinking. But it is often called higher order thinking, which she challenges this statement a lot in the paper. But it's also coming from these like really old ideas about like the homunculus, or like the little man that's like in your head that's like running everything. And so she says that now that little guy in your head is called the supervisory attentional system. So they just like gave it a more like science jargony name, and but it's like not that different from that like really old idea. And she says that it defers agency. So instead of saying like, oh, that, yeah, like I did that, I made a mistake, it's like, oh, that's my executive dysfunction, it's not me, you know. And it kind of defers agency farther and farther back to where it just kind of like gets really abstract, I think. But there's a reason that it's so popular, I think, is that she says it represents normalcy, or this like idea of normalcy. And it kind of acts as this like explanation for everything. So you can kind of apply it to like all kinds of different disorders or problems that you have in your life.
Yeah, like she talks about how she cites examples of how executive dysfunction is basically used to explain ADHD, autism, schizophrenia, Tourette syndrome, OCD, like all of these different disorders and dysfunctions. Like it neatly explains all of that. And that's part of the why she says that it's so popular, right?
Well, but really what it's doing is like teaching kids, like, here's the right procedure and here are the steps you need to take to attain your goals, but not actually teaching people how to solve problems in like novel or like innovative ways, which actually requires like distractions and diversions,
right?
And like, divergent thinking is what that's called.
And with a real like a real attention to meaning, right, is what we really like. It's the opposite of that, right? Like it's all about the rules and the procedures devoid of sort of context and meaning. And I was thinking about some examples from my days of being a teacher where like I taught high school English in the early 90s. It's going to date me. And I had a department head who was very old school and very rigid about like how to teach writing and grammar. And I would have kids who would say to me, "Oh, you can't have a topic sentence that's a compound sentence." Right, of a paragraph, because Mrs. Darling says that a topic sentence by definition is about one idea and a compound sentence by definition is about two ideas. And so like they had these like really strict rules in their mind about how you could or couldn't write. And I was like, that is like so devoid of like expressing yourself and putting meaning on the page. And it's not how real writers write at all. And also when I was teaching college writing, I had such a hard time getting students to formulate a thesis. Like they just couldn't really understand what a thesis was. And I would say it's like your opinion. It's like what it is that you care about and what you want to express. And then you're going to build an argument to sort of support that. And they'd be like, "Oh, but we're not allowed to have opinions in papers." Like they were just so confused that they couldn't actually engage with ideas because they had all of these rules that they had been taught that were like, that's what executive function is about, right? It's about the rules for their own sake. Anyway, those were just a couple of examples that came to my mind when I was reading this section of the paper. So I think
I think she also makes an argument that from like an evolutionary standpoint, it's counterproductive because evolution is about like adaptation and variation. And if you're not engaging in that when you're like trying to solve problems, you're not going to come up with anything new.
Right.
So there's this quote that I really like. She says, "With the loss of dynamic, diverse interactions, out goes the potential for feedback, growth, change, creative adaptation. Static centrality is given full weight, and with it, the pseudo-legitimization of a central, unidirectional command and control agency. The price for control comes at the cost of the capacity to grow." Which, like, I love that line.
Yeah.
Like, you can't grow if you're, like, constantly obsessed with, like, controlling everything and doing it right,
Right. Yep. Another thing that she argues, which I think is really interesting, is that the whole idea of executive function relies on this sort of tautology. She says that often executive function is called a higher order thinking, but she quips that basically the only thing higher order about it is that it sort of floats above and is detached from meaning. Like in that sense, maybe it's higher order. But that basically, she says, it's a set of rules and procedures that are self-referential and tautological. And Jesse has asked me to explain what a tautology is.
Yes, please.
And I sort of intuitively know what a tautology is, but I had to actually Google it to come up with some examples. So basically a tautology, or there is not exactly the same thing, I think, according to people who really care about these distinctions, as circular reasoning, but I'm going to talk about them as basically the same idea. It's kind of where you define something by itself and then sort of presume that that proves the thing. So for just a few examples of tautologies are, everyone loves Rebecca because she is so popular, right? Like,
they love her because they love her.
They love her because they love her.
Yeah.
Exactly, right? You must obey the law because it's illegal to break the law. Harold's new book is well written because Harold is a wonderful writer. America is the best place to live because it's better than any other country. And this one is like one that is kind of in the air a lot, especially in the sort of wake of the Trump era. You can't trust fake news because it's all lies, right? And the EF tautology, the tautology of executive function, is what executive function tells us is that we should follow these rules to achieve that goal. And then if you ask why, the answer is because that's what goals and rules are. Goals are meant to be achieved and rules are meant to be followed, right? So we should follow these goals. We should achieve these goals because that's what goals are meant to be achieved. And we should follow these rules to do it because that's what rules are. They're things that you follow, right? But there's no there. There's no connection to meaning and no interaction with what she calls the information and meaning field. And in this way, it's just really profoundly, I think, anti-analytical and anti-critical. So like when I was, when I was teaching freshman writing at the college level, again, these kids, like, they didn't understand how they had such a hard time engaging with meaning and with ideas, and it wasn't their fault. They were really super interesting and smart and all the rest of it, but they had so much of this drummed into them. I usually felt like a semester of freshman writing was basically just undoing all the damage that had been done to them since middle school. Like, they would have these great experiences with writing as elementary school students, and then by middle school it was, you know, the 5-paragraph essay and all of that horror. And so I would try to teach them what it meant to be analytical. And the example that I gave was, I don't know if any of you know, like, toddlers, but like 3-year-olds are notorious about asking why about everything, right? Like, you know, if they ask you, I don't know, like, you'll answer their question and then they want to know why to the answer. And then they want to know, I should have come up with an example of it, but you know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah. Like, that's what we should be.
That's how I was.
Right. Well, that's how curious, inquisitive people are. They don't take the answer as given. They don't accept it as automatically and intrinsically valid. They want to know the underlying reason of why. And that is exactly the opposite of what executive function is. Executive function is, this is the goal, and you're going to follow these rules to get to it, and don't ask why, basically.
It's like basically when you ask your mom, like, why can't I do that? And then she says, because I said so.
Right.
That's executive function.
Exactly. And then if you don't follow that, and certainly in school that happens all the time, right? Like why, you know, you're given a math formula, and then you like can do the math formula, but if you dare to ask why, or why does it matter, or what's the usefulness of it, or how does it even work, then you start to be perceived as like problematic, as disruptive, as oppositional, and all of those kinds of things, right? So anyway, that's the tautology of executive function is, you should follow these rules because rules are meant to be followed, and you should achieve this goal because that's what a goal is, the thing that you achieve, without any sort of reference to any outside meaning or reasons or context.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I had a really hard time in math growing up because it was so abstract to me. And then there was always like the questions where there would be like, do this problem, but show your work. And you had to like show the exact procedure. And I could never do those because the way that I did math problems was like I had to visualize stuff. And I couldn't like draw it out or like explain how I was like doing that.
Yeah.
Because my brain didn't work the same way. So I got really horrible grades in math.
Because you couldn't show your work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I had a hard time with like the procedure and also just being like, what is the point? And like, why are there letters in this formula? Like when I got to algebra, I was like, I couldn't do it. I was like, why are there letters? It doesn't make any sense.
This is math.
This is numbers.
Yeah. So, yeah. So riffing on that sort of higher order idea, if you want to continue with this.
Oh, she says, EF is certainly not higher in intellectual capacity than insight, understanding, concept formation, pattern recognition, or any other of the terms used to refer to excavating meaning out of an information field. So, like, these things are really, like, devalued, I think.
Yeah.
And especially because a lot of them have to do with, like, feelings.
Right.
So...
And preferences and values.
And those are, like, not things that we're supposed to be relying on to, like, guide our lives or whatever. We're supposed to be, like, all about logic and reason.
Right.
But she says at another point in the paper that, like, I'm paraphrasing, but, like, there's no reason to try to attain a goal unless you, like, feel that you want to or that you should. Like, you have a feeling that you want to go towards that goal. And, like, that's why people do it.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's so much in there about, like, how, like, students and workers are just, like, so disengaged because there's, like, no meaning in these goals that, like, we're supposed to want to attain. And we don't feel anything for it, you know?
Yeah, I also thought it was interesting in this quote that you just gave that EF is certainly not higher in intellectual capacity than insight, understanding, concept formation, and pattern recognition, which I would say are like 4 huge strengths of neurodivergent people, right? Like sort of often an instantaneous insight that you can't really explain, that you can't really like show your work for. It just came to you whole, all of a piece. Like this happens to me all the time. And understanding and concept formation and pattern recognition especially, like these are things that we're really good at. But they're things that, you know, and I would agree are way higher in sort of meaning making than rule following and goal setting and achievement are. But they're not really valued very much in our culture, certainly not in our school culture and in our work culture. Yeah.
She goes into this other quote about how EF, or it might make sense if our brains were like computers and as just like beings, we were like closed systems that like weren't affected by the world around us, but we are like dynamic systems and we're always being influenced by each other and by our context and whatever. And I think that was really an interesting point to make because there's all these metaphors about the brain as a computer, like just in pop culture in general. And we use a lot of like computer language to express like how our brains work. And I think that kind of like came about with the rise of like computing and the invention of like new technology. I read this book called Testo Junkie, which is about testosterone and hormones. And the author talks about how like historically hormones started to be described as messengers around the same time in history that like trains and telephones were being invented.
Interesting.
And I feel like it's kind of similar with like brains and computers. Like we're using these metaphors, but the brain is not a computer because it's like responsive, and always kind of like responding to the environment and the things that are happening to us.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All right. I'm going to take a look. I'm going to sum up this section in just a minute, but I'm going to first just take a look at some of the comments. Great to see you all here. Let's see. Samantha's here and Bug is here. Mad Doll is here. Yarrow. Paint is here. Hi, Paint. Nice to see you. Samantha says, yeah, I hear people say things like, I finally understand why I can't focus. I have executive dysfunction, which doesn't actually explain or mean anything. Exactly. Like that's another example of sort of a tautology is I can't focus because I have executive dysfunction, where the definition of executive function is not being able to focus. Like it doesn't explain anything. It doesn't explain whether or not you actually have trouble focusing. Like, do you have trouble focusing on everything?
Yeah.
Or just the things that other people say that you should focus on, right?
And then it's like, why?
And then why? Right. And
Yeah,
then why
no
do you have
why,
trouble
and
focusing?
There's no how, and like, yeah.
Like I have trouble focusing on things that are meaningless and that I don't care about.
Mm-hmm.
But like, I'm kind of down with that,
Mm-hmm.
Cindy, hi Cindy, says, I understand tautology is a kind of fallacy. Yeah, it is a sort of logical fallacy where you are purporting to offer evidence in support of an initial assertion, but the evidence that you offer is the same thing as the initial assertion, right? So like I had another example, I think. One of the things that Dr. Miriam says is that the justification for rules are other rules. And that's an example, sort of a tautology, that you should follow this rule. Why? Because it's a rule, right? Or because it's the law.
I think you said one, like follow the law because it's illegal not to.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Follow the law because it's illegal not to. So that would be like if you're trying to make an argument about why you should follow the law, it would be a logical fallacy to say the reason you should that you should follow the law is because it's illegal not to. Like that's not actually a reason. Like that's just saying the same thing. Right? Yeah. The reason might be like we need laws to keep order in society, or the laws represent morale. I mean, we can agree or disagree about actual reasons, but because it's illegal is not actually a reason for that argument. All right. Yeah, it's great to see you, Cindy, and it's fine to jump right in. We love that. Cindy also says, why do I have to do it in these arbitrary steps I've put myself into? Exactly, because it's proven you weren't able to make it possible without those tested steps, right? The arguments are, yeah. Madeline's Magical Videos says, your thoughts on external systems that help keep you on track? I know our creative thinking is a blessing, but are there systems you use that help channel the creativity into a finished project? I can try to talk about that a little bit at the end, Mallory, but we're going to try to stay on track with the executive functioning critique first. But we talk a lot about that kind of stuff here. It's not. I will just say very simply that I don't think that most of the sorts of hacks and strategies that the ADHD industry, for example, will be very happy to sell you for a price. They generally don't work very well unless you first start sort of disrupting the shame that you have about failing. And so it's there. The short answer is that I don't think that there are lots of good strategies and hacks that can be helpful, but I don't think that there's any simple solution to those problems.
Yeah, like just make a to-do list.
Right.
Like,
just
we all roll our eyes at that. Like,
exactly.
Okay.
Like anytime that the word just is in a suggestion, it's probably not a very good one. Liminal Lizzie says, this reminds me of how we've designed things to be more human-like, i.e. designing cars sort of kind of resembling human faces, and then maybe with computers it's similar that where we conceptually separated brain and body. Interesting. And Samantha, I think this is in response to my comment about Samantha's initial comment, exactly, using the term executive dysfunction as an explanation cuts off further inquiry based on curiosity, which I think is at the heart of the problem of executive function. But what's so disturbing to me is that it's so ubiquitous now. Like I did a I gave a sort of workshop for some teachers fairly recently, about a year ago, about, I don't know how to take this off. Oh, about what executive function is. And I was sort of offering my kind of critical perspective on it. And one of the teachers said that in her school, kids get grades on their executive functioning skills.
Oh my God.
Yeah. It's so meta, but in like a really bad way, you know?
That's
so meta.
So intense.
Yeah. And then Bug says, the tautologies of EF feel so interwoven with the tautologies of capitalism.
Yeah. I think exactly that is the point.
It's so spot on. And that's, I mean, we were talking about this right beforehand, that I think the reason that it is so ubiquitous is because executive function is all about, you know, achieving a goal in the most undistracted and focused and efficient way. It's not actually about creativity or innovation. It's about production and efficiency. It's like, you know, they really are capitalist values masquerading as skill.
And it's like authoritarian. It's
right.
like putting the authority like in your own head, you know?
Right.
And ADHD describes like anyone who's like anti-authoritarian, basically, or wants to think outside of those rules.
Yeah, exactly. Cindy says grading my executive function would be nuts, even as an adult. Well, it's just like, it's so bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's, first of all, executive function is already devoid of, it's already stripped of meaning, extracted from meaning. Mm-hmm. And then to put a grade on the thing that doesn't really, there's no there.
Yeah.
And you're still gonna, it's like a skill for its own sake. Like,
how
grading
good are
people.
You at following rules?
The rules, basically. Like, how good are you at being efficient and compliant, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, I want to sum up this little part of the paper with this quote where she says, in contrast to actual thinking, the conceptualization of EF is removed from substance and more concerned with formal procedure. And the first thing that came to my mind was something that still boggles my mind is when you ask somebody what they do and they say that they're a consultant. I'm always like,
what does that mean?
What does that mean? Like, what do you consult about? Like, I don't actually care whether you're consulting or directing or demand. Like, I don't care what that verb is of what you're doing. Like, what is the substance of it? But people will just be like, they actually think that that's an answer. Like, I'm a consultant, and that's supposed to mean something. Mm-hmm. I've always been so confused by that. But if you look at a lot of the so-called executive functions, they truly also have no substance. For example, like prioritization is considered an executive function, right? The ability to prioritize. But like, prioritize what?
Yeah.
Like, we're not bad at prioritizing. We just prioritize the wrong things according to our schools and our employers, right? And our parents and all the rest of it.
Well, priorities are also like a preference.
Right.
By definition.
Like
assuming that like all like priorities are like universal, but like people have different priorities.
Exactly. So like, for example, this is an example I often give, but like the kid in the classroom who's playing with Legos and is told that they need to put their Legos down so that they can go do the math worksheet, and who is defiant and oppositional and refuses to put their Legos down and go do the math worksheet and says things like, my son used to say these kinds of things all the time, but that's stupid. Mm-hmm. Why? Like, I don't want to. That's stupid. Why should I do that? They're like, it's not that they don't have priorities. It's that they don't share the teacher's priorities. They have a very clear priority, which is to keep playing with the Legos. Yeah. Right? So it's just an example of how the like basically compliance has been abstracted from meaning and then dressed up as like prioritization. Another example is focusing too, like focusing on what? Mm-hmm. Like, I don't think most of us have that much trouble focusing on something that has grabbed our attention. Yeah. The problem is that we can't focus on the things that we're supposed to be focusing on, which are often meaningless and stupid.
Yeah.
Right?
Because they're not our priorities.
Exactly. Yeah. So like, we want to ask like, focusing on what? Why do we even care about this goal? What if there's another better answer? But when kids do that in school, they get into a lot of trouble. And if we do that in the workplace, right, we get into a lot of trouble. At least that's my experience, for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that like the executive function directly came out of the context of school.
Yeah.
And in school there's a curriculum, which is the rules, and an authority, which is the teacher. Like you can't really separate that concept from that context,
Right. Exactly. And I want to talk a little bit in a little while about my favorite whipping boy when it comes to executive function.
Whipping boy?
Charles. I mean, I would like to like give him a few lashes. What's his name? Barkley. Yeah.
Russell Barkley. My arch nemesis.
Exactly. Well, because it's so curious to me that he purports to be a libertarian, right? And like, I think if you start to dig down into what libertarianism is actually about, there aren't as many contradictions as there might seem to be on the surface. But I'm kind of intrigued by at least the surface contradictions, because a libertarian actually believes that individuals should have the right to make choices, right, about their own priorities, and that there is one of the quotes that I cite with horror often from his book is that there is no such thing as the common good. Like he asserts that as a core value underlying his entire theory of executive function. There is no such thing as the common good. And then he cites all of these libertarian
Didn't Margaret Thatcher say something like that?
Oh, absolutely. And he actually cites, like, if you start digging around and going down rabbit holes and getting distracted, you discover that he's citing like fascist sympathizers for this proposition that there is no such thing as the common good. So like, if you really believe that, it would seem that you would believe also that the kid should get to play Legos if he wants to play Legos, right?
If you believe in freedom.
If you believe in freedom and liberty. I mean, of course, and that's a whole other conversation, because I don't think that libertarians actually do believe in freedom and liberty. What they believe in is property and wealth. In fact, I saw a critique once of the term libertarian because anarchists used to use the term libertarian and used to talk about liberty, right? And then it kind of got co-opted by what we now consider modern day libertarians. And this critique was saying they should really be called propertarians, because what they care about is property and wealth. And so what Russell Barkley is like fanatic about, like he's obsessed with people not being a burden on society. And even not being a burden on their families and their parents. And so anybody who has any kind of deficit that creates any sort of dependence or need for care, to him is just a complete tragedy, because of the burden that he is imposing on other people's liberty, that they are imposing on other people's liberty. So anyway, that was a little side
That's good context.
track. Yeah. I part of the reason I wanted to bring it up is because I had somebody in a comment recently, I mean, a couple months ago, but a comment where I was talking about Barkley, who tried to argue that like his politics don't matter. But the point is that his politics very much matter, because his politics are very pro-capitalist, and executive function is a very pro-capitalist paradigm.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Let's see. There's a whole bunch of other comments that I thought I might take a look at before we move on. Let's see. Oh yeah, Kate says, "Oh no, that's so upsetting to hear regarding the teacher saying students are graded on EF." Yeah, I was just appalled, and she was too. But like, that's part of the problem for teachers, I think, is that even if you have like a different paradigm in your mind, there's often not a lot you can actually do. Yeah. Mallory says, yeah, I agree. I got tense even hearing that. Believe me, I do too. Kent says, hi, we were graded on how organized our Trapper Keepers folders were. Yep. We'd have to produce papers from the half of the year. Right. Like, exactly. Like,
just teaching kids how to manage documents.
that's what's important, right? Not like the
Yeah.
substance of the things that they've written on those documents. That doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
It's just, can you keep them organized? So you can't focus. I won't help you find out why or how to make it work for you, but you get a C-. Exactly. Yeah. Priorities also circles back to your values.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Exactly. But values are considered, there's a term, prepotentate urges. Like that's a term apparently in the executive functioning world. And it's
mean?
bad. It's like things that feel urgent, that are urging you to like get off the track, right? Like like feelings and values and that kind of stuff. Priorities. Yeah. Kent, this reminded me of some art courses in uni that graded our sketchbooks in levels of quirkiness to take notes. Kate says, I was the student who was made that I had to put down my math worksheet in order to participate in stretching movement exercises with the class. Was mad. You were the student who was mad. Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Mallory says, this has been something that has been so helpful to me learning about myself. My niece asks why in that way all the time, the way that kids will. And I am just like, good point, kiddo.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that's what I would say to my students is like, you need to be more like a 3-year-old. You need to get curious and tenacious about demanding answers. You know, you have a right to that. Bug says, prioritization feels connected to questions like, what do you do? What do you want to be when you grow up? And how it's implied that a job should be the answer and priority. Oh, wow. Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah. That's really interesting to me, especially as the parent of a kid who is 19 and who isn't going to college. And so like suddenly like, well, if you're not going to college, then you should be like launching a career. You should be like starting a profession of some sort. You should know what you're going to do. Yeah. I'm just like, he's 19.
I hate that question. Like, what do you do? My whole body just like shuts down and I'm like, I don't know.
And they totally mean, what do you do to make money? You know, because I have some interesting stories that I'll tell another time about when I tried to answer that question when I was like a homemaker and a mom. People were not interested the second that they found out that you didn't make money at it. Even if I was like literally running a school, you know, they didn't care. They were like, if you're not making money. All right. So we're going to move on because the next section of this paper, Dr. Miriam talks about what she calls the unjustified devaluation of error and preference. This sort of ties in with what we were just talking about, right? The assumption is that, this is a quote, the assumption is that thinking is at its best when it is single-mindedly focused on a narrow path to efficient goal attainment. And so from that, you get these so-called executive functioning skills of maintaining sight of the goal, inhibiting distractions, inhibiting prepotent urgencies. That's like feeling too strongly about something that you actually care about.
Or like your passions.
Yeah, exactly. Keeping track of what you've done and what you're doing, which is sometimes called set maintenance, self-monitoring, and self-regulation. And these are your notes, but it's exactly right that it's like basically the opposite of design thinking, which is not what I'm always talking about.
Well, you're not allowed to make mistakes.
Right.
You have to know exactly what you're going to do before you do it. And you're not allowed to like deviate. Or,
right.
Like, yeah. So it's like the complete opposite of like how creative people solve problems, I think. Right.
And at one point she talks about how by definition, and I just love this, if there's already a set procedure or path for solving the problem,
Yeah.
then it's not a problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
By definition,
Yeah.
a problem is something for which there isn't already a solution,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, like, to do anything that's creative or innovative, you cannot follow this executive functioning model. Yeah.
Well, because like mistakes are part of the process. It's like necessary to figure out the problem. And there's an example that she gives about like decorating your room and like trying to figure out how to use the space, which is something that you talk about all the time.
Right.
And basically like you have to like try stuff out and like see what works for you and like your preferences and like your situation, and like that's how you figure out a problem, is failing basically,
Right.
and making errors and like diversions.
Yeah. That's funny because just this morning I woke up and I was like, oh, maybe I have this art studio in the downstairs where our living room used to be. And that's to me sort of an example of divergent design, in that I put my art studio where the living room is supposed to be. But I've been feeling kind of bad because I'm not really making visual art in the way that art studio was set up for. And instead, I'm really focused on video. And I had been thinking about, in fact, I had hoped to be able to do it today, but I couldn't make it happen, moving the video setup down to that room. But then I was like, but it's at the front of the house. It's going to be really loud. If somebody comes to the door, the dogs are going to bark. And what I should really do is move it to the back of the house downstairs where the living room is. And then I was like, I think that I've talked myself back out of doing that, at least for a little while, because it felt so daunting.
Yeah.
But like, that's one of my very most fundamental principles of divergent design, is that you will never be done because you will constantly be changing, and your space is going to need to change with you. You know, when I set up an art studio, I was painting and making collage, and now I'm really into video. And so it may be that I have to find a different place, you know? Anyway, yeah. I don't know if you want to talk about these sort of, what she was talking about is these questionable assumptions that underlie executive functioning skills.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we went
Have
over
we gone
it,
over
like,
that?
Like goals are best attained without diversion.
Right.
And you have to make the plan before you solve the problem.
Right.
Solving a problem is not, you don't know how to do it.
Right, exactly. Like, I liked this quote a lot, that making a plan that this is a questionable assumption, that making a plan can occur solely prior to the problem solution rather than evolving or emerging in sort of more even contemporary parlance. This book is from 2005. Rather than emerging as part of the problem solution itself. I really liked that. Like, you can't know what the path will be to solving this problem ahead of time, because by definition it's new, right? So the solution itself is going to emerge from the trial and error. And that's exactly what design thinking is all about. Yeah, I
told you about I'm like figuring out how to start plants from seed.
Oh yeah.
And I spent like weeks on YouTube, like garden YouTube, like watching all the videos where the tutorials, and like reading all the stuff and like trying to read everything so that I knew like the exact steps and whatever. And then I like sat down to do it and I couldn't remember any of that stuff. So I just kind of like did what I thought made sense. And then a couple weeks later, like only certain seeds germinated. And I noticed like, oh, it's the big seeds that germinated and all the little ones didn't, so I must have done something wrong with the little ones. But like I know that I read that like seed depth is correlated to like the size of the seed, but like I had to actually experience that to learn, and understand.
Right.
And then the next set of seeds I started, I planted all the tiny ones like right on top and like sprinkled a little bit of dirt so they were like barely covered, and they all germinated. So now I understand it, but like, and I know I had read that in all of my like obsessive research, but it like didn't really stick until I had to just like do it and like encounter that problem and then like work through it, you know?
Exactly. And that's why I think that in the context of design, we talk about how there is no such thing as failure. There's only data, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the failure of your first go round at planting those seeds became data for the second go round.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you had the data ahead of the experience, it often just can't stick.
Yeah, because there was no meaning or like
Exactly.
context
There's
to it.
no
I didn't
context or
understand.
meaning.
And I think there was like feeling involved too, because I was like really disappointed that like half my seeds didn't come up. And so that like drove me to figure it out.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly. Because where is it that she says, I don't know if we've come to this part where she talks about, where is that thing about
Feelings.
Here, right. Yeah, here.
Oh, feelings and preferences are like distractions.
Under the executive functioning
Mm-hmm.
paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
But I was thinking about this. A goal is no goal unless there is a felt need to achieve it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I love that she says, it's like a dig, like, in order to accept the notion of EF, one would have to suspend common sense, which, like, is so true. Like, you really do.
Yep.
Because you're just looking to, like, authorities and rules instead of working through a problem in a common sense way, and which is what I did with the seeds, I guess.
Right.
You know.
Right, but in your notes,
Mm-hmm.
you note that it's really like anti-democrat. It's really anti-democratic as well as like anti-intellectual, anti-analytical,
Mm-hmm.
anti-critical. Like because it so much of the executive functioning paradigm appeals to authority.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, she says lack of democracy within the concept of EF becomes lack of democracy in its application. So, like, to me, she's kind of saying that kind of feels like EF is a little bit fascist.
Yeah.
It's just about, like, central authority making the rules, and that's all that matters, and it doesn't matter what you think or, like, feel.
Yeah.
Or, yeah.
Well, and this is where I had in my notes to talk about Berkeley and libertarianism and the apparent but not actual contradiction. And I do think that, like, the more I dig into this, the more I realize, like, the lie that libertarianism is actually about freedom and liberty. It's actually about, and we were talking about this before, that, like, the sort of the notion of property and wealth is so fundamental to libertarianism that basically being a human is almost defined by owning property and having wealth or the capacity to build wealth. And that if you're not in that class of being who owns property or has wealth or the capacity to build wealth, then you're almost not a human being. Like, all these concepts of freedom and liberty don't really apply to you if you're not in that capacity. And in a capitalist society, right, the way to do that is to follow the rules, right? Or at least, I mean, it isn't really, but that's what they would like us to believe, because the way for other people to build wealth is for the workers to follow the rules, right? Yeah. All right. Well, let's go look at a few more comments, and then we're going to get into this section about how executive function replaces meaning. And I'm going to let Jesse do the talking there. Let's see if we can find some. Spiral Nerd says, somebody tried to small talk with me recently by asking, so what puts food on the table? And when I said food stamps, he had no idea how to respond or proceed. I thought it was kind of funny. I obviously think that that's hilarious.
Really funny, yeah.
That's a great answer. What could we do on the mechanical, repetitive parts of creative process, though? Yeah, again, that's another question about sort of the sort of strategies and hacks, and I do like to talk about that. I guess what I would say is that I think that once we are no longer feeling desperate shame about who we are and how we are, and we're no longer feeling like failures, and we've really reframed failure as data, and we're really living in a life and in a world that is designed more for how we function, then we actually will have, when your life is rich with meaning and connection and creativity, then I think that the capacity to do things that are repetitive and boring and aren't intrinsically meaningful increases, actually, because it's no longer just for the sake of it. It's like in service to some greater purpose. Mm-hmm. But I think that if you haven't done all of the rest of that work, then and you're just trying to get yourself to do things that feel really boring and meaningless, it's almost impossible, I think, to do that in any kind of sustained way. And it will, in fact, end up adding to the shame and the frustration and all the rest of it. That could be a great topic. I have some videos about disrupting shame and about design. I think I did some stuff on design thinking that you might want to take a look at, Cindy, that might be helpful in at least understanding kind of the framework and theory that I'm coming from, for sure. Yeah, Whitney says, yes, I am constantly making tweaks and improvements to my space. Right. And like the need for that will end when you die. And I really believe that, like, until then, you will constantly need to be making tweaks and changes. And I don't even like to think of it necessarily. I mean, some of them may, in fact, be improvements, but I don't even necessarily think of it so much as improvement as just like, my needs have changed, and so now my space has to change to reflect those needs. And, it may or may not be an improvement over the configuration I had when my needs were different, but they're not the same anymore, right? Cindy says, then there are situations where an immediate creative response is required, and at least for me, it's very difficult for me to manage without trial and error. Yeah, that's definitely true. But I think that like the need for like an immediate creative response is often, like, I'm not saying that it isn't in your life actually happening, but that it's usually artificially imposed from outside, mm-hmm. right? And Whitney says iterative design, exactly. And Whitney says, yes, improvement in that makes my life easier to live in that space. Exactly. All right, Jesse, let me see if I can bring this back up.
Oh, you want to talk about the symbol learning?
Yeah, we were going to talk about how executive function replaces meaning. And yeah, talking about symbol learning. And I just think that this is really interesting. And I think that there's a lot of overlap between people who, well, in fact, I would say that dyslexia is a form of neurodivergence. But yeah. I think there's a lot of overlap among ADHD and mm-hmm. autism and people who have dyslexia and other so-called learning disabilities. Mm-hmm. And I think she's talking about that. So I thought mm-hmm. that, and I think you understand this better than I do.
Well, so I was just going to let you. Symbol learning, I think, refers to, like, she says it's learning things that are decontextualized. So like learning something that's just like super abstracted from any kind of context or environment, which I feel like is most of what our education system is. Mm-hmm. Like we're memorizing the facts and like the rules. And I think like dyslexia is a good example of this because like it's literally a struggle with interpreting symbols like letters and language. And it's a disability in a society that is like obsessed with reading and writing and how like literacy like determines our ability to succeed, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
But actually like dyslexics have these other skills, like with like space, like visual spatial skills. They're very good at detecting anomalies. Like they can look at like an image and see like a mistake in it really quickly, like faster than other people. And also like they have a lot of like big picture sort of like seeing the whole thing and how everything connects skills. But like these like detailed oriented skills necessary in like symbol learning and like that are really important in like reading and writing are like not so much. So that's kind of like how dyslexia became like a disorder, I think, in our society. And I guess a good example of symbol learning is we were talking about like cameras.
Right.
And you want to learn how like exposure works. And I studied photography in school, and I think that like the way that I really learned it was doing like analog, like 35 millimeter classes, because that took all these things like aperture, shutter speed, ISO, which like are just like meaningless words that I'm throwing out there that like you don't get because it's so abstracted, and it made it really like literal and like something you could like touch and experience and like understand in a better way. So I always suggest that people, like, if you really want to learn how like light works and how like cameras work, just go back, get a 35 millimeter camera and like, you know, play around with it and kind of experience what aperture and shutter speed and ISO, what all of that means in the like context, instead of just trying to, because like I think with a digital camera it's like all symbols that are just like totally abstracted and like you're like, I don't know what any of this means, these are just big words,
right?
And so I think that's like a good example of symbol learning versus like experiencing what it means.
Yeah, and I think that it's a perfect example of how trying to learn something in a decontextualized way. Like I'm not dyslexic. Like I don't have trouble with like language symbols, like written language symbols at all. But I feel like there must be like another term for and I think that what it gets labeled as is a failure of working memory, right? But like until I can attach something, connect something to something that is like concrete and meaningful to me, it's very hard for me to hold on to it. So like I have watched multiple videos about, you know, shutter speed and ISO and all of that stuff, and I've taken extensive notes, and like I can hold on to it for a little while, but it always slips away because I can't, like there's nothing that I can put it's exactly what you're saying, there's nothing that I can put my hands on, and like there's no actual experience that I can connect it to, and so I can't hold on to it, right? But if that's the only way that I'm supposed to be able to learn, like if the goal is to understand how a camera works, that there's just no way for me to do that in a sort of linear, efficient way. Like the only way that I'm going to be able to do that is like by diving in, sort of like you with the seeds, right? Like going out and shooting things and ideally doing it analog. But yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely do it with a digital camera, but there's something about it that's just not, it doesn't hit the same.
I think that for me, it would be much easier. Yeah. I mean, I have this a lot with a lot of things, and I even sometimes wonder, like, I don't know what the name of it is, but there's that condition where you have a hard time recognizing faces.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't have an extreme case of it, but I do have it for sure. And what I've noticed is that I can't recognize somebody's face until I have a lot of context for that person. Like once I've like talked to them and know something about them and like can connect them with stories and places, then I can recognize their face. But like it's kind of embarrassing. Like people that I've lived next door to for years, because I only ever have like really passing sort of conversations. I think it's the same sort of thing. Like it's just not connected to any meaning. Like it's sort of data that I'm supposed to be able to process without it being embedded in a field of meaning. and I'm just not any good at it.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously I'm capable of higher order thinking.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
Well, I think like EF is decontextualizing, and then it's like once you're forced to like if you're forced to inhibit distractions, then you're being pulled out of your environment. And like once you decontextualize yourself and what you're doing, then the only thing that you can do is like fall back on like rules and procedure,
Right.
because you can't like look to the context to like figure out what to do.
Right. Exactly.
So it's like she calls it a last resort. When you don't have access to like other kinds of meaning.
Right. Exactly. She also talks about, I don't know how much we want to get into all of this, but she talked about, what was it I was going to think?
Oh, the experiment with the
right.
ADHD kids.
That was really interesting, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You want to tell them about that?
There was an experiment where the task was to finish a sentence with a word that didn't make sense in the sentence. That was like the goal. And apparently the kids who were diagnosed with ADHD failed at this task more than the other kids because they weren't as willing to let go of like making the sentence mean something. So they would finish the sentence with a word that made it make sense, but that was not what they're supposed to do.
Right.
And they called that like poor inhibition.
Right. Like
but it's just like, why are you making them do this meaningless task? You know,
the point of the study was to see whether students could inhibit their impulse to finish the sentence meaningfully, and instead finish the sentence with a word that was meaningless. And somehow, like, the capacity to do that was a test
better.
of like your impulsivity, right? Like lacking impulsivity in that test was supposed to be a good thing. And she says that these ADHD kids responded more often with sense than nonsense. And she goes on to say, one is faced with a good deal of respect for the ADHD children who could not so easily abandon meaning.
Yeah, I respect that. And also relate to it.
Yeah, exactly. She says those who have less patience with bits of information that are neither related to each other nor to any external referent are likely to abandon inhibition and let meaning take its course. Like, yeah, I think that often we talk about being impulsive, right? But impulsivity is actually like often sort of a leap towards something that feels meaningful in that moment, right? Yeah. Oh, and then the other thing that she talked about was that that those who get to the meaning intuitively, like if you don't need procedures and rules and people telling you what to think to get to some sort of sense of meaning, if you just intuit meaning, then you find executive function irrelevant, she says. And often those are the students identified as ADHD. And she says, it should be of great concern to us that all resistance to inhibition of meaning is considered dysfunctional in our schools.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and like, I wrote about this in the newsletter recently, but like all of these public intellectuals are saying that we're having this like crisis of meaning because culturally we've moved towards like prioritizing science and logic and objectivity, which doesn't really exist, but we think that it does. And and we've kind of moved away from like spirituality and like insight and these kinds of things. So a lot of people are turning to stuff like executive function to understand the world in the absence of like this like greater cultural meaning, I think. Yeah. The next thing that she talks about that I think is really interesting is she says that executive function is basically a fight or flight state, and that it's associated with anxiety, and it's like the anxiety that drives the goal-directed behavior. And she uses like a lot of kind of like biochemical kind of examples and like studies to justify this, which I don't like totally fully, I would be a little bit critical of. But I think it's interesting she talks about like epinephrine levels, and that ADHD diagnosed kids, they found they had lower epinephrine levels when they weren't on stimulants. And she proposes that maybe the stimulants raise those epinephrine levels, basically like create a state of anxiety that helps people do this like goal-directed behavior. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I just had this thought that like there's sort of a common trope about how in a crisis or under extreme pressure, often we do really well, right? Like
because we're anxious.
Because we're anxious.
Yeah.
That kind of like extreme anxiety can be super focusing.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think just sort of low levels of generalized anxiety can be super the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, what else is there? Yeah, I think that this is another important thing that you highlighted, Jesse, about the role of power in this concept, because it so much relies on executive function, so much relies on somebody else, somebody outside of you, some authority figure predetermining what the goal is.
Yeah.
Right. And then also predetermining the path that you must conform to achieve that goal. I mean, if you think about school, that's what it's all about. There's a curriculum and there's a teacher. Right. And so like power dynamics are kind of embedded in it.
Yeah. But we're all supposed to think that it's just like a natural way that our brain works.
Right.
So it's really like obscured the role of power, I think, in the whole concept. And then we're just supposed to internalize it and like self-monitor, self-regulate, and kind of do like the authorities work for them, I guess.
Right.
Barkley said this quote, which makes me really upset. Those who rein in their immediate passions can also behave in more socially acceptable ways. Like,
right.
What? It's all about being socially acceptable, but you have to rein in your passions. Like,
in order to do that,
like, what's the point of living if you don't have passions and like, you know, prepotent urgencies, I guess.
Yeah, like he's not exactly who I'd want to have at my dinner table, right? Yeah, so I think that this is an interesting point that you put into your notes about kids making mistakes.
Well, the thing that we always ask is like, am I doing this right? And like when you teach kids executive function as the way to solve problems, then they can't like think critically about how to solve a problem. They just have to go back and like double check their work, make sure they did the procedure correctly, and they're just always asking like, did I do this right? Am I doing it right? And I feel like so much of my own like shame and anxiety now as an adult stems from that question, like, am I doing it right? Or did I do this wrong? And it just kind of like, I had like a epiphany, like, oh, that's what I was taught in school, that there's a right way to do it. And I don't know, that feels very like traumatizing for people who are like more creative and who solve problems in different ways and like are divergent thinkers, you know?
Exactly. So I don't know if you want to read this last quote as sort of a summing up of the...
Oh, yeah. This is the conclusion of the paper. Learning comes to be defined as robotic execution of prescribed rules. Those who can operate in this way depend upon anxiety to drive the process. Those who cannot are said to have a deficit, a dysexecutive syndrome, where the search for meaning and interest in real problems becomes a disability.
Right. The search for meaning and interest in real problems is the disorder, right? Yeah. I mean, I don't think that you could sum it up better. Yeah. The distinction between like the pathology paradigm of neurodivergence and the neurodiversity paradigm of neurodivergence, right? Yeah. Anyway, I think that we're at the end of our notes, but let's look quickly at some more comments and see if people have some things to say or questions. Cindy says, I think that's why I had such a difficult time learning at sociology class. So much abstract and philosophic information that I had to work with. None stuck to me up to the exams. Exactly. I have that trouble. Like I think of myself as somebody who like loves to do critical theory, but when I read these really abstract sort of philosophical and theoretical stuff, it's the same thing. I can't make it tangible enough to grasp it for very long. I totally know what you're saying, Cindy. Mad Doll says, I recently built a website, a Shopify store, set up Google Ads, analytics, set up a community page, and created products. If someone asked me, how did you learn that? Can you teach me? I'd be like, ... Yeah, exactly. Like,
well, they said, I just did it.
I just did it. Right, exactly. It was all intuitive and probably not the right way, and I didn't follow any business leader or marketing step by step. Can't help you. I've definitely been in that position for sure. Cindy says, so if you have chronic anxiety dysregulation and you use ADHD stimulants, you'd certainly go nuts.
I mean, I can't handle stimulants because I have so much anxiety, and it just like makes it way worse.
I can't really speak from experience, and I'm not an expert at all about medication. I remember taking stimulant medication. I took something called Strattera for a while, which is more in the class of like antidepressants. It's a norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. And I found it mildly helpful, but I'm pretty sure in retrospect that it was a placebo effect, which is real. And it did help me at the time, and I'm grateful for the relief it gave me at that time. But I don't know enough, Cindy, about medications, and honestly, that whole section of the paper, which is very small and towards the end, where she starts citing sort of biochemistry studies and stuff, like that's the place where both Jesse and I felt like maybe the paper started to fall apart a tiny bit. Like if we were going to have any critique of it, it would be in that area.
Well, it was kind of like, it wasn't central to the, like most of her argument is about context and environment and stuff. So it wasn't that annoying to me, but.
Yeah. Right. Cause I think that her point and our point is that so little of any of this is actually anything that's happening in our brains. And so much of it is what's happening in our contexts and in the world as it is designed not for us. Mallory says, my friends have always said that if there was a super emergency, I would be the person to call because I go into the focus zone. I would be interested to read more about that. Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty common phenomenon. Like, I think that if you go to like emergency rooms, like ER docs are often neurodivergent, and like emergency responders, like, I think that there's something to it for sure.
It's kind of funny though, because I freeze. Like if something is happening, I'm just like, and I can't move and I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I do think it's different in different contexts too. Like if it's a context that you like intimately know how to handle it, you know?
Yeah. Like I
if
guess,
it's your expertise.
Like, or I guess when I was like a server in restaurants, like that's a very like urgent kind of, it's not an emergency, but the whole entire thing is like urgency, and I guess it was helpful in that context. Yeah.
Amanda says, I'm curious to hear more of both of your thoughts on stimulants. I find them helpful but exhausting in the long run, very unnatural, and yet so is our current society. I'll let, if you want to talk for a minute about that, and then I have my
own. I mean, I think they're like a useful tool, and you know, if they help you, then I don't see why you shouldn't use them. I don't think that they're a cure or like a fix, and I think they're a useful tool in the context of a society where you have to do these like linear goal oriented things every day. But yeah, if they help. I also find them exhausting and I don't use them. So
Yeah, I mean I would say basically the same thing, is that I'm pretty agnostic about medication. My feeling is like whatever helps. And I believe that placebos are real, so sometimes things are a placebo effect, but it doesn't matter, because if it helps, that's all that matters to me. But I also have heard again, I've never taken stimulant medication. My son was on stimulant medication for a while, and he grew to hate it and eventually went off of it. And now, it has for years now, been functioning quite well. I mean, he suffers from other like anxiety and stuff, but I don't think that stimulant medication would necessarily help with that. Yeah, so I guess my feeling is whatever works in the short term, if it's stuff that has to happen, that you have to get done, then go for it. And if you find it exhausting in the long term, then use the stuff that stimulant medication makes you capable of to try to redesign your life, so that you don't need it as much.
Well, like I used to use them like in college and in high school. I used them to write papers, and like I couldn't use them long term because I just had like really intense crashes off of them every day, and like it was just like a horrible like daily experience. So I was kind of forced to figure out other ways to write, and now I write in this very like spirally kind of like chaotic way where I start like all these different essays and I flip back and forth between them, and I do finish stuff, but
I had
to find a different way to do it without stimulants.
Yeah. It's interesting. Paint says, I think society faces a huge loss when we have to hold back our passions, because who knows where those passions could lead or what problems they could solve. I think about this all the time, Paint. Like all the time. I think about, like, I don't really believe in wasted time or whatever, but I do think about all of the like lives that have just been squashed because these really brilliant, creative people couldn't conform to capitalism, basically, and white supremacy. I mean, they go hand in hand, obviously. Mallory says, I still have that internal narrative quite strongly. Am I doing this right? Yeah.
Yeah, it haunts me to this day.
Yeah. That was so much like what kids would ask when they came into my classroom. When I taught freshman writing, it was like such an honor too, because like often you were the first class that a student had in college, like the very first class on their first day of college. And again, so much of the work of that semester was just undoing the damage. Like you couldn't really build something up until you had undone so much of that damage. And I think it's the work of a lifetime to undo, Paint says, well, Butrin helped me as an alternative to stimulants. When I've been on stimulants, they've helped for a while, but I also did go nuts. So it is difficult. It is a difficult thing to manage. Yeah. We're actually, this came up in a peer support group on Tuesday in Divergent Design Studios, which is the online community for neurodivergent creatives that I'm part of. And it wasn't the topic, but it sort of came up. And so I think it actually may become the topic for next week. People were saying that they don't have any place to go to talk about medication. Like either people are like for it or they're against it, or like there's like it gets so like laden with all this stuff, and like there's very few forums where people can just say this is what worked, this is what didn't work. So I think that next week, if you're interested in having this conversation, I think that's going to be the topic of our 3 general peer support groups next week in Divergent Design Studios. And if you're interested in joining Divergent Design Studios, there's a link in the description below. And there's also a link to all of the many, many things that Jesse writes and finishes on a really regular basis. Yeah, like I'm kind of intimidated these days by Jesse because they're just churning stuff out like that's so high quality and so amazing. And you want to say anything about your newsletter?
Oh, I hate talking about myself.
Okay.
Yeah, I post twice a week. One of the Monday posts are free, and then Friday posts are for paid subscribers. And the Friday post is like kind of a roundup of stuff that I've read in the week and kind of commentary on it. And the Monday post is just usually like an essay. And yeah, it's working out.
And the name of the newsletter is Sluggish.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
And you can find
so bad at marketing.
And there's a link in the description below to that, but it's something like sluggish.
It's sluggish.substack.com.
Sluggish.substack.com.
I think I'm going to get a domain name for it.
Ooh, that would be fun.
Soon. So
yeah.
I'm trying to decide what it
that doesn't
be.
have Substack in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah. So if any of you are still here, we would love to have you join Divergent Design Studios. Both Jesse and I are members. We'd love to have you subscribe to Sluggish. We'd love to have you join our Patreon if you think that the work that we do here at the Spiral Lab is work that you'd like to see continue, because we do have bills to pay. I mean, we do make a little bit of money right now.
We have many different things going on.
But we do make a little bit of money right now from the YouTube channel, but it isn't by no stretch of the imagination even covering our costs. So if you'd like to help us with that, that would be fantastic. But no pressure, whatever is sustainable for you. And I'm so happy that we have done this twice now. Yeah, and the microphones worked out. I think we didn't hear anybody say that the microphones were wonky. And
that was another example of design thinking versus executive function.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We had, if you weren't here a couple of weeks ago, we had some problems with our microphones, and then we just figured it out.
Figured it out by messing it up.
Exactly. The next iteration. All right. Great to have you, and hopefully we'll see you next week. All right. Bye.